Talira moved through the dense jungle, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The thick, dark trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches covered in glowing fungi. The air smelled of damp earth and distant storms. She tightened her grip on the bone knife strapped to her leg, her muscles ready to react to any sudden movement. Vranok was not a kind world. It was a place where only the strongest survived. The ground itself could swallow a creature whole, the rivers were filled with acid-spitting serpents, and the skies carried storm clouds that rained fire. For as long as Talira could remember, she had been told that her kind, the Vrakesh, were the only true Deathworlders. Other species in the galaxy lived on gentle, weak planets. They needed technology, weapons, and soft comforts to survive. The Vrakesh, however, needed nothing but their own bodies and instincts. Talira had always believed that. She moved with silent steps, her clawed feet barely disturbing the thick moss on the ground. She had been sent to hunt today, to bring back food for her clan. The creatures of Vranok were fast, deadly, and always alert. But Talira was faster. She had trained since childhood, running through firestorms, swimming in toxic rivers, and climbing cliffs that crumbled beneath her grip. She was strong. She was a Deathworlder. A distant sound made her stop. It was a strange noise, unlike anything she had ever heard before. A sharp, unnatural hiss, followed by a loud crash. Her heart pounded. No beast of Vranok made such a sound. Carefully, she crouched behind a thick tree, her pointed ears twitching. Smoke. A column of dark smoke rose from the east, beyond the jungle. Her eyes narrowed. That was no natural fire. Something, or someone, had fallen from the sky. Talira hesitated for only a moment before making her decision. She would investigate. If it was something dangerous, she needed to know. If it was something useful, she would claim it for herself. She moved quickly, leaping over fallen logs and dodging the sharp vines that dripped poison. The air grew hotter as she neared the crash site. When she finally reached the edge of the jungle, she saw it, a strange metallic object, half buried in the rocky ground. Its surface was burned and broken, the metal twisted and smoking. Sparks flickered from broken wires, and the scent of burning fuel filled the air. Talira had seen old wreckage before, remains of ships that had come too close to Vranok's violent storms. Most of the time, the bodies inside were already gone, devoured by the planet's creatures. But this wreck was fresh. And then she saw him. A figure lay just beyond the wreckage, partially covered in dust and debris. He was not Vrakesh. His skin was smooth and pale, his hair dark and tangled. His body was covered in strange fabric, clothing, but different from anything she had seen before. Talira's breath caught in her throat. A weak-worlder. She had never seen one in person, only in old records. The people from soft planets, the ones who needed weapons and armor to survive. They were not like her. They were fragile, weak. They did not belong on a death world. And yet, here he was. Talira took a cautious step forward, her knife ready. The stranger groaned, his eyes flickering open. For a brief moment, they locked eyes. His gaze was filled with pain, but also something else. Determination. Talira hesitated. Weak-worlders did not belong here. They could not survive here. But then why was this one still alive? The stranger groaned, his face twisted in pain as he tried to move. Talira stayed still, watching him closely. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, and the strange fabric he wore was torn in several places. He was injured, but he was alive. She had expected a weak-worlder to be helpless, to break under the weight of Vranok's harshness. And yet, despite his wounds, he was still breathing, still struggling to rise. That made her curious. Talira stepped forward, her sharp claws pressing into the dirt. The stranger turned his head toward her, his eyes locking onto hers again. They were dark, filled with exhaustion, but there was no fear. Talira frowned. Every other off-worlder she had seen in the old records had fear in their eyes when speaking of death worlds. But this one, he did not seem afraid. He coughed, his voice rough and weak. "Who are you?" Talira didn't answer. Instead, she crouched beside him, studying him more closely. His bones looked too thin, his skin too soft. How had he survived the crash? He should have been dead the moment his ship hit the ground. The man groaned again and tried to sit up. He winced, gripping his side. His hand came away stained with blood. Talira's eyes flicked to the wound. Deep, but not fatal. He would live if he was strong enough. "You should not be here," Talira said finally, her voice firm. The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Didn't plan on it." Talira tilted her head. His words carried a strange tone, dry, almost amused, despite his pain. She did not expect that. She studied him for a moment longer, then stood up. "You will not last long," she said simply. He let out a short breath. "You're probably right." Talira hesitated. It would be easy to leave him here. The planet would decide his fate. If he was weak, he would die. If he was strong, he would survive. But something about him made her pause. Talira had always believed that only the Vrakesh could endure a true death world. Yet this man had crashed here, alone, and he was still alive. She didn't like questions without answers. With a sigh, she extended her hand. The man looked at her in surprise. For a moment, he didn't move, as if he wasn't sure whether to trust her. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, not as weak as she had expected. Talira pulled him up with ease, though he staggered slightly as he found his footing. He was tall, but not as strong as Vrakesh. Still, he stood steady. "What is your name?" she asked. He took a deep breath before answering. "Caden." Talira nodded. "I am Talira." Caden glanced around at the wreckage. His ship was completely destroyed, broken beyond repair. His expression hardened, but he did not panic. "I need to find shelter," he said. "And supplies." Talira crossed her arms. "You do not know this world. You will not survive alone." Caden smirked slightly. "Then I guess I should stick with you." Talira raised an eyebrow. He was not what she expected. Weak worlders were supposed to be fragile, fearful, but Caden was neither. For the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps the Vrakesh were wrong. Maybe they were not the only Deathworlders after all. Caden took a deep breath, steadying himself. His body ached, and his wounds burned, but he ignored the pain. There was no time for weakness. He had crashed on an unknown planet, and survival was his only option. Talira stood beside him, arms crossed, watching him closely. Her golden eyes held no pity, only curiosity. He had the feeling that she was judging him, testing him. He didn't blame her. From what little she had told him, this world was beyond dangerous. If he showed even a hint of weakness, she would leave him behind. Caden exhaled. He wasn't planning on dying here. "We need to move," Talira said finally. "The wreck will attract predators." Caden looked around. The jungle beyond the crash site was dense and dark, filled with strange noises. In the distance, something let out a low guttural growl. He swallowed. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured as much." Talira turned and started walking. She moved with ease, her steps silent despite the uneven ground. Caden followed, though his legs felt heavy. He forced himself to keep up. The jungle was unlike anything he had seen before. The trees stretched high into the sky, their twisted branches glowing with faint blue light. The air was thick with moisture, and strange, alien insects buzzed around his head. The ground was uneven, covered in thick moss and sharp, jagged roots. "How did you survive the crash?" Talira asked suddenly, glancing at him. Caden let out a short breath. "Didn't have much of a choice." Talira frowned. "That is not an answer." Caden smirked slightly. "I've been through worse." Talira raised an eyebrow. "You come from a death world." Caden hesitated. "Not exactly," he admitted. Earth isn't as extreme as this place, but it's not peaceful either. We've had to fight for survival in our own way. Talira studied him for a moment. You do not seem afraid. I don't have time to be, Caden said. Fear doesn't keep you alive. Action does. Talira seemed to consider that. Then, without warning, she stopped. She lifted a hand, signaling for silence. Caden froze, his muscles tensing. His heart pounded as he listened. At first, he heard nothing but the hum of distant creatures. Then he heard it, something moving through the trees. Talira's eyes narrowed. Predator. Caden's grip tightened. What kind? Talira didn't answer. Instead, she crouched low, pulling a bone knife from a sheath on her leg. Caden didn't have a weapon. His gear had been destroyed in the crash. He clenched his fists, scanning the trees. Then he saw it. A massive creature emerged from the shadows. It had 6 legs, each one covered in thick, armored scales. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its mouth was lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. A deep growl rumbled from its throat. Caden inhaled sharply. That's big. Talira didn't respond. She moved quickly, her body a blur as she dashed forward. The creature lunged at her, its jaws snapping, but she twisted to the side, slashing at its neck with her blade. The knife barely cut through its thick hide. Caden's mind raced. He had no weapon, no armor. But he wasn't useless. He had survived worse. As the creature focused on Talira, Caden grabbed a thick branch from the ground. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The creature turned toward him, its glowing eyes locking onto his movements. Caden didn't hesitate. He swung the branch with all his strength, aiming for its head. The impact sent a sharp vibration through his arms, but it barely fazed the beast. The creature roared, lunging at him with terrifying speed. Caden barely dodged, rolling to the side. He felt its claws graze his arm, tearing his sleeve. Pain flared, but he ignored it. Talira moved in again, slashing at its exposed side. This time, her blade found a weak spot, sinking into its flesh. The creature howled in pain, thrashing wildly. Caden saw his chance. He grabbed a jagged rock from the ground, and without thinking, slammed it into the creature's eye. The beast screeched, rearing back in agony. Talira didn't waste the opportunity. She drove her knife deep into its throat. The predator let out one final gurgling growl before collapsing. Silence filled the jungle. Caden exhaled, his body shaking from adrenaline. He glanced at Talira. She wiped the blood from her knife, her expression unreadable. You fought well, she said after a moment. Caden chuckled breathlessly. Not bad for a weak worlder, huh? Talira smirked slightly. Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought. Caden let out a slow breath, looking down at the fallen creature. He had survived another day. And for the first time, Talira wondered if humans were more dangerous than they appeared. Caden wiped the sweat from his forehead, his breathing heavy. The massive predator lay motionless on the jungle floor, its dark blood seeping into the ground. His hands were still shaking from the fight, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had faced danger before, but this world was unlike anything he had ever known. Talira crouched beside the dead beast, her sharp eyes studying it carefully. She ran a clawed hand over its thick hide, her expression thoughtful. This was young, she muttered. Caden raised an eyebrow. That thing was young. Talira nodded. An adult would have been twice this size. Caden let out a slow breath. Great, can't wait to meet its parents. Talira smirked slightly but didn't respond. She pulled her knife from the creature's throat, wiping the dark blood on a nearby leaf. Then, without hesitation, she began cutting into the beast's body. Caden watched in confusion. What are you doing? Talira didn't look up. Taking what we need. Caden hesitated, then crouched beside her. He had seen hunters skin animals before, but Talira worked with practiced efficiency. She sliced through the thick hide, pulling away strips of meat and carefully removing the creature's fangs. "These will be useful," she said, holding up one of the large curved teeth. "Strong, sharp. We can make weapons." Caden nodded slowly. "Smart." Talira glanced at him. "You should help." Caden frowned. "I don't have a knife." Talira tossed him a sharp, broken fang. "Use this." Caden caught it, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. He mimicked Talira's movements, slicing through the beast's flesh as best as he could. The work was messy, but it kept his mind focused. As they worked, the jungle around them grew darker. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, distant but unsettling. "We cannot stay here," Talira said. "More will come." Caden nodded in agreement. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. This planet was alive in ways that were terrifying. Talira stood, slinging a bundle of meat over her shoulder. "Come." Caden followed without question. His body ached, his wounds throbbed, but he kept moving. The alternative was death. They walked for what felt like hours. The jungle became thicker, the trees twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. Caden's legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't complain. He refused to show weakness. Talira led him to a rocky outcrop, a small cave carved into the stone. She stepped inside first, scanning the area for danger. Then she nodded. "This will do for now," she said. Caden collapsed onto the cave floor with a groan. Finally, Talira dropped her pack and began stacking stones near the entrance. "We need fire." Caden frowned. "Do you have matches or something?" Talira gave him a confused look. "What is a match?" Caden sighed. "Never mind." Talira pulled out 2 pieces of stone and struck them together. Sparks flew, catching onto dry leaves she had gathered. Within moments, a small fire flickered to life. Caden stared. "Okay, that's impressive." Talira smirked. "You have survived this long, but you cannot make fire." Caden shrugged. "Back home, we have easier ways." Talira sat down across from him. "Your home, Earth. Tell me about it." Caden hesitated. He hadn't thought much about Earth since the crash. Thinking about home made the situation feel more real, more hopeless. But Talira was watching him, waiting. He took a deep breath. "Earth isn't as deadly as this place, but it's not easy either. We have storms, wild animals, disasters. We've had to fight to survive, just in different ways." Talira tilted her head. "But you have technology. Weapons." Caden nodded. "Yeah, we adapt. We find ways to make things easier, to protect ourselves. But in the end, survival is still about being smart, being strong." Talira was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. "Perhaps you are not as different as I thought." Caden gave a tired smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. The night outside was filled with distant howls and rustling leaves. But for now, they were safe. For now, they were survivors. Caden woke to the distant sound of something moving outside the cave. His body ached from exhaustion, but his instincts screamed at him to stay alert. The fire had burned low, casting dim, flickering light on the stone walls. Talira was already awake, crouched near the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the jungle beyond. "What is it?" Caden whispered, sitting up. Talira didn't look back. "Something is watching us." Caden's muscles tensed. After everything he had seen on this planet, that wasn't good news. He reached for one of the makeshift weapons they had made from the predator's fangs, gripping the sharp tooth like a dagger. A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees. Talira's expression hardened. "It followed us." Caden swallowed. "You mean that thing's mother?" Talira nodded. For a moment, silence filled the cave. Then, the jungle exploded with movement. The creature burst from the shadows. A massive beast, twice the size of the one they had killed. Its 6 powerful legs crushed the undergrowth as it stormed toward them. Its glowing red eyes locked onto the cave, and its jaws parted in a deafening roar. Caden jumped to his feet. "We can't fight that thing here." Talira was already moving. She grabbed her knife and sprinted out of the cave. "Then we take the fight to it." Caden hesitated for only a second before following. His heart pounded as he dashed after her. Running straight at a monster twice his size wasn't exactly his idea of survival, but they had no choice. The beast lunged. Talira rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its massive claws. Caden wasn't as fast. He barely managed to dive out of the way as the ground shook beneath him. Talira struck first, her blade slicing across the creature's side. The wound wasn't deep enough to stop it, but it was enough to make it angry. The beast whirled toward her, swiping with deadly speed. Talira leaped back, but this time she wasn't fast enough. The creature's claw caught her shoulder, sending her flying. Caden's stomach dropped. Talira. She hit the ground hard, skidding against the dirt. But to Caden's shock, she didn't stay down. She rolled back to her feet, blood dripping from her arm, and glared at the beast with fire in her eyes. "Stay behind it," she shouted. Caden clenched his jaw. No time to think. Just move. The creature focused on Talira, preparing to strike again. Caden took the chance to sprint toward its side. He gripped the sharp fang in his hand and drove it into the beast's leg with all his strength. The monster howled, staggering for a moment. It turned its head toward him, rage burning in its glowing eyes. "Bad idea," Caden muttered. The creature lunged. Caden barely managed to duck as its jaws snapped where his head had been a second ago. He rolled across the dirt, his heart racing. This thing was too big, too strong. But he had an idea. "Talira," he shouted. The eyes. They're weak. Talira's gaze flicked to him, then to the beast. Without hesitation, she leaped onto its back, climbing with the speed of a hunter. The creature roared, thrashing wildly. But Talira held on. Caden didn't stop moving. He grabbed another sharp fang from their supplies and ran toward the beast again. This time, he aimed higher. Talira reached the creature's head just as Caden lunged. She drove her blade deep into one of its glowing red eyes. The monster screeched, its body convulsing. Caden didn't waste the moment. He jumped onto its side, using its thick hide as leverage. With all his strength, he stabbed his weapon into its other eye. The creature let out one final, deafening roar before collapsing. Silence. Caden lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Every muscle in his body ached, but he was alive. Talira stood over the fallen beast, breathing hard. Blood dripped from her wound, but she didn't seem to care. She turned to Caden, studying him for a moment. "You fought well," she said. Caden let out a tired laugh. "You already said that." Talira smirked. "You keep proving it." Caden shook his head, pushing himself up. He looked at the massive creature, then back at Talira. "I think we just killed the biggest thing in this jungle," he said. Talira glanced at the trees, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps." Caden followed her gaze. Deep in the jungle, distant growls echoed. Maybe this wasn't over yet. Caden leaned against a tree, his breathing heavy. His muscles burned from the fight, and his body was covered in dirt, sweat, and a few fresh cuts. The massive beast lay still on the ground, its lifeless body proof of their victory. But the jungle around them was not silent. More sounds echoed in the distance, deep, rumbling growls, the rustling of movement in the dense foliage. They were not alone. Talira stood beside him, gripping her blade tightly. Her golden eyes scanned the darkness beyond the trees. She was injured, but she stood firm, unshaken. Caden wiped his forehead. "I don't suppose that was the last big thing trying to eat us." Talira didn't look at him. "No, this world does not rest." Caden exhaled sharply. He was starting to understand why Talira thought her species were the only true Deathworlders. This planet was relentless, A sudden noise made both of them turn. The bushes ahead rustled, something large moving toward them. Caden tensed, gripping the sharp fang he had used as a weapon. Talira crouched slightly, ready to strike. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was not another beast. It was Rakesh. The newcomer was tall, with dark gray skin and piercing yellow eyes. His body was covered in scars, and his armor was made from the bones of predators. He carried a long spear with a blade fashioned from some kind of dark metal. Talira's expression hardened. Cordal. The warrior's gaze flicked to the fallen creature, then back to them. His eyes narrowed. You killed it. His voice was deep, laced with disbelief. Talira straightened. We did. Cordal's gaze shifted to Caden, studying him with a mix of curiosity and something else, something almost like irritation. The weak worlder helped. Caden smirked tiredly. I have a name. Cordal ignored him, turning back to Talira. You left the village to prove yourself, and you return with an outsider. Talira's jaw tightened. He is not weak. Cordal stepped closer, towering over Caden. He does not belong here. Caden crossed his arms. I didn't exactly plan on crashing onto your death jungle, but here we are. Talira took a step forward, placing herself between them. He survived. Cordal's expression remained unreadable. He looked at the beast again, then back at Caden. Finally, he let out a low breath. Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought. Caden raised an eyebrow. Thanks, I think. Talira ignored the tension and turned to Cordal. Why are you here? Cordal's expression darkened. The elders sent me to find you. There is trouble. Talira frowned. What kind of trouble? Cordal glanced at Caden again before answering. The Sky Watchers have seen something. Another ship. It is coming. Caden's stomach twisted. Another ship. Cordal nodded. Not yours. Something else. Talira's gaze sharpened. Hostile. Cordal's jaw tightened. We do not know, but it moves like a hunter. Caden exchanged a look with Talira. This couldn't be a coincidence. If another ship was coming, it could mean danger, not just for him, but for Talira's people. Talira turned to Caden. If this is your kind. Caden shook his head. It's not. He hesitated. But I might have an idea who it is. Talira studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. Then we must be ready. Cordal scoffed. You expect us to fight alongside an outsider? Talira's eyes flashed. If we do not, we may not live long enough to argue. Cordal was silent for a moment. Then finally, he gave a slow nod. Caden let out a breath. He had survived this planet so far, but something told him the real fight was just beginning. Caden stood on the rocky ridge, looking up at the dark sky. The distant shape of a ship moved through the clouds, its lights flickering like a hunter searching for prey. His grip tightened around the bone dagger in his hand. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else, something dangerous. Talira and Cordal stood beside him, their weapons ready. The village below them was hidden beneath the thick jungle, but Caden could sense the tension in the air. Talira's people, the Cordalians, were preparing for war. Cordal turned to Talira. If this ship brings danger, we should strike first. Talira shook her head. We do not know their numbers or their weapons. We must be smart. Caden exhaled. I have a feeling they're not here to talk. Talira's golden eyes flicked to him. You know them. Caden hesitated. Not exactly. But I know the type. Pirates, slavers, scavengers. People who see a world like this and think it's theirs to take. Cordal growled. Let them try. Caden sighed. The Cordalians were warriors, no doubt, but they were used to fighting beasts, not ships with energy weapons. If these invaders had advanced technology, brute strength wouldn't be enough. The ship rumbled louder as it descended, coming to a stop above the treetops. A bright beam of light shot down, cutting through the jungle darkness. A metallic ramp extended, and figures emerged, tall, armored beings with rifles in their hands. Their helmets glowed with red visors, scanning the area. Caden's stomach twisted. Mercenary raiders. He had seen their kind before. They didn't come for diplomacy. They came for control. One of the raiders stepped forward, his voice amplified by his helmet. "Attention, inhabitants of this world. You are now under the control of the Varkan Syndicate. Surrender, and you will live. Resist, and you will burn." Cordell snarled. "They think we are prey." Talira's grip tightened on her blade. "Then we show them they are wrong." Caden took a deep breath. He was no stranger to fights, but this wasn't like the jungle beasts they had faced before. These enemies had armor, guns, and numbers, but they had something the raiders didn't: this planet itself. He turned to Talira. "We can't fight them head-on, but we don't have to." Talira nodded, understanding. "The jungle is our weapon." Cordell smirked. "I like this plan." The first strike came from the shadows. As the raiders moved forward, scanning the trees, Talira's hunters attacked. They moved silently, using the thick jungle for cover. Razor-sharp spears flew through the air, striking the raiders in their weak points: neck joints, exposed arms, and visors. Caden stayed low, using the terrain to his advantage. He crept behind one of the raiders, gripping his sharpened fang tightly. Before the enemy could react, he drove the weapon into the back of their knee. The raider let out a strangled cry, falling to the ground. Cordell leaped from the trees, his blade slashing through another raider's helmet. The mercenary barely had time to scream before collapsing. The jungle erupted into chaos. The raiders fired their weapons wildly, but the Cordelians were too fast. They struck from the shadows, disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. The jungle itself fought with them. Thick roots tripped the raiders, strange carnivorous plants snapped at their armor, and the creatures of the night sensed the blood in the air. Caden ducked behind a fallen log as a plasma blast scorched the ground beside him. His heart pounded. He needed a real weapon. Then he saw it. One of the fallen raiders had dropped their rifle. Caden lunged for it, rolling across the dirt as another shot barely missed him. He grabbed the gun, quickly adjusting to its weight. He had no idea how these raider weapons worked, but he didn't have time to figure it out. He pointed and pulled the trigger. A bright bolt of energy shot out, striking a raider in the chest. The mercenary flew backward, crashing into a tree. Caden grinned. "Okay, that works." Talira landed beside him, her blade dripping with blood. "You have their weapon." Caden nodded. "Let's even the odds." Talira smirked, grabbing another rifle from the fallen. Together, they turned their stolen weapons against the raiders. Minutes felt like hours, but slowly, the tide turned. The raiders had technology, but they didn't understand the world they had landed on. The jungle belonged to Talira's people. The beasts that roamed the night attacked anything that smelled of weakness, and the wounded raiders were easy prey. One by one, the mercenaries fell. The last of them tried to retreat, scrambling back toward their ship, but Cordell and his hunters were already there, blocking the path. The lead raider, the one who had demanded their surrender, raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking. "Wait, we can make a deal." Talira stepped forward, her golden eyes glowing in the firelight. She said nothing. The raider took a step back. We didn't know what this world was. Talira moved like lightning. One final strike, and the raider fell. Silence. Caden let out a breath, lowering his stolen rifle. It was over. Cordell wiped the blood from his blade. "They thought we were weak." He looked down at the bodies. They were wrong. Talira turned to Caden. "You fought well." Caden smirked, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Not bad for a weak worlder, huh?" Talira chuckled. "Not bad at all." By dawn, the jungle was quiet again. The Cordelians searched the raiders' ship, taking anything useful. Their weapons, their supplies, everything now belonged to the true Deathworlders. Caden stood by Talira, looking up at the sky. You think more will come. Talira's expression was unreadable. Maybe. But we will be ready. Caden nodded. He had survived this planet, faced its monsters, and fought alongside its warriors. He had arrived as an outsider. But now, he wasn't sure where he belonged. Talira studied him. You could leave, if you wished. The raider ship could take you far from here. Caden hesitated. Earth seemed so far away now. He had come from a world that called itself strong, but after seeing Talira and her people, he wasn't sure anymore. Finally, he smiled. I think I'll stick around. Someone has to keep proving humans aren't weak. Talira smirked. Then welcome, Caden of Earth. The jungle whispered around them, the planet itself seeming to acknowledge him. Caden wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was one of them.